Well, my name is Tal Howard, and I direct the Jerusalem and Athens Forum that's sponsoring this event tonight. This is an annual debate in the program, but this is the sixth annual debate in the program. It's become a little tradition, and this has been a wonderful group. And I'll keep my words fairly short. I just want to say a few things about the assignment, and then a few things about our format tonight. And then I'll introduce the two teams and give the resolution for the debate. Like I said, it's something that's done each year. The students weigh in on a number of possible topics. I make clear it's not a complete democracy, that I sort of shepherd and a number of other faculties work with them on the topic, but they have an opportunity to weigh in on the types of things that they would like to discuss. It's an interdisciplinary program, so students come from all backgrounds, and each year they have different interests and different capabilities. I should say it's once the resolution is formed, though, it's more or less completely student-owned and operated. I have no idea what they're going to say today. I haven't coached them. I haven't looked at their talks, so this will be just as much a surprise to me as it will be to you. This particular resolution, though I owe a word of thanks to two folks. One is Carl Giberson, the director of Gordon College's. Actually, there he is. He walks in the door. The director of Gordon's Forum on Faith and Learning, Science, and Religion. That's right. And also, I owe a word of debt to a former colleague of mine, Gilbert Mailander at Valparaiso University, who is on the President's Commission on Bioethics. That he also help shape the particular resolution. For the students' sake, I should say that they're not experts on this topic. This is the topic treated tonight. Some have backgrounds in philosophy. A few have backgrounds in science. It's really an effort for them, given a resolution, to have about 4 months or so to do the research, to come up with the speaking roles, and to present the debate for you tonight. And I also should say that they do not necessarily, the positions they're arguing tonight are not necessarily their own. They do have an opportunity to weigh in on what side, more or less, they might fall in from the resolution, but they're not necessarily assigned that side. So I trust they'll argue heartily for their position. This is not necessarily their personal position. And it's also just that the broader aims of the debate are to bring before the Gordon community a topic of moral, political, theological importance, to raise it into kind of greater public consciousness here, and give the students an opportunity to work on public speaking. In my experience, there almost inevitably will be more dangling questions at the end of the debate than answers, but in part that's part of the exercise. In terms of format, there will be a series of statements and then rebuttals, beginning with the pro side to my right, and the con, the negative case, will get the final statement at the end. And these will be Ryan Groff. I should introduce Ryan right here, who spoke earlier, but raise your hand up. And just, I think we should even give him a word of applause right now. In terms of putting this together and getting everything set up and the handouts and some of the PR, he's the one to really thank here. But you can see the sequence of the statements and rebuttals on the handouts you have. There's just a little information about sort of genetic testing and some terms on the back that you might want to consult. Amy Holcomb, Zachary Capalbo, Ingi Kim, Sarah Grimes, Joshua Bell, and Lindsay Reed. And each team has a group leader, and for the affirmative case, it was Ingi Kim. And for the negative case, Libby Baker, Hillary Sherritt, Joanna Gallagher, Corinne Bolt, Holland Stewart, Joel Nillette, and Joanna Smith, or Joby Smith. And it was Corinne Bolt who was the leader for this team. And I think that's all I have to say. So we will begin with the opening statement from the pro team.
Some compare the sequencing of the human genome to discoveries of Galileo and Newton. Just like scientific discoveries of the past, which provided us insight into our own world and the rules that govern the universe, knowledge of our biological information is yet another important discovery. Our DNA can be described as our body's instruction manual, and understanding our human makeup has many positive implications. For one, looking at human DNA has shown us that we are more than skin deep, that the races have more similarities than differences. Our genes reveal that there is more genetic variation within one single racial group than between, for example, black and white. But more importantly, by looking into the information in our bodies, we have gained more tools to alleviate suffering, cure diseases, prevent disorders, and find medicine that will be personally tailored to the patient. Because when we look into our genes, we discover how our bodies interact with the environment. This knowledge will help us take better care of our bodies and that of our families. Largely because genetic testing brings tangible relief to human suffering, the biotechnologies that enable genetic testing and its application does promise more good than harm for humanity. But how does genetic testing work? Well, doctors can see that those who have a certain disease have specific genetic mutations that they share. By noting these mutations, and by testing others if they have these mutations, doctors can now know whether a patient is also likely to have a certain disease. Here are two of the many examples where pain and suffering is relieved in human lives through genetic testing. The first example probably has affected you already, and will affect your children and your children's children. Newborn babies are widely screened for a number of disorders within 48 hours of birth. Through genetic testing, thousands of infants born with potentially catastrophic but treatable diseases are spared early death or mental disability each year. One such disease is known as PKU. PKU is a metabolic disorder that damages a baby's brain tissue and has symptoms that go unnoticed until the baby is about 6 months old. By then, the damage on the baby's brain is already done. But through genetic testing, PKU is detected right after birth. The baby is placed on a special diet and is saved from mental disability. In many cases, the genetic testing of babies reveal information about what care newborns should have. Simply understanding this bit of information saves lives. Secondly, genetic testing enables doctors to screen for hereditary breast cancer. The National Cancer Institute says that 12% of women born today will be diagnosed with breast cancer. Among the 192,000 cases of breast cancer diagnosed in the United States each year, 5 to 27% of these are hereditary and can be detected through genetic testing very early on. Once genetic testing confirms this, patients can take a drug called tamoxifen, which reduces the risk of breast cancer by 50% in women at high risk. For those with hereditary breast cancer, genetic testing may mean life. But its effects on cancer is not limited to breast cancer alone. Genetic testing holds implications for blood, brain, colon, kidney, liver, lung, and stomach cancer, to name a few. These are just a few of the many medical benefits of genetic testing. Genetic testing has been around for half a century, yet the human genome, decoded only in April of 2003, will herald forth an unprecedented number of medical cures and discoveries. Genetic testing must be understood as medicine. Christ spent so much time healing the sick while he walked the earth. There must have been a reason for this. In Luke 17, we see Jesus meeting 10 men with leprosy. Standing at a distance, they shout to him, "Lord, Master, have mercy on us." Christ listens to their plea, and he heals. In another occasion, Christ is in a synagogue, and the Pharisees are watching whether he will heal on the Sabbath. Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? Christ asks. Then he restores the man's shriveled hand. Just as Jesus had empathy for the suffering and for the hurting, we too must model Christ. As Christians who live within a society, we have the responsibility to be good stewards to the gifts that God has given us. Whether it is our physical bodies, our minds, our society, or the various technologies, we have to use for good what is bestowed. The biotechnologies that enable genetic testing provide us to be such stewards. But like all things given to us by God, genetic testing too can be abused. Reasonable skepticism is important. But when we deal with the problems of this world, let us not forget the immense promise inherent in the gifts of God. Genetic testing does not give us the power to solve all of the world's problems, yet it does enable us to solve some. So when you listen to the other speakers tonight, let me encourage you to remember the immense medical benefits of genetic testing, the value Christ placed on healing, and how we should value the health of others. And finally, genetic testing's positive implications for the Christians called to stewardship. Thank you.
Good evening. I think the negative case tonight could sum up the affirmative case's 6 minutes in about 2 words: better health. And while we commend the affirmative case for the very real benefits of increased diagnostic accuracy, the potential for cures, and individualized medicine that you heard, better health is neither universally agreed upon, universally enforceable, or the only or even most significant measure for global human good. The resolution tonight asks us to look at more good than harm for humanity. Keep that in mind as you listen to the rest of the speakers tonight. The affirmative case just mentioned Galileo and heralds the half-century of genetic testing that has already promised so much good. But we'd like to remind you that decades after World War II, eugenics was lawfully implemented in the United States. We suggest that perhaps this is more harm than good, a consequence and a historical factor to make in your decision. They talk specifically about alleviating suffering and Christ's call to heal. However, we would remind you that genetic testing is diagnostic and a medicine of probability. And our ability to diagnose far outstrips our ability to cure. The half-century that genetic testing has been around and available for scientists has not provided cures for breast cancer, for cystic fibrosis, or for many or any of the genetic diseases that are prevalent and individuals are suffering from today. And they talk about the ability to cure disease, but we remind you that a diagnosis is not a cure. And while genetic testing may be beneficial in diagnostic accuracy, it is by nature probable science. And as my partners will tell you, the overly optimistic expectations of the pro that such prognoses are going to be beneficial to medicine are overly optimistic. We ask you that you consider that in tonight's debate. While we understand that such things may have some possible benefits, we urge you to think about the most important thing, that better health is perhaps not more good than harm for humanity. Thank you.
The mere presence of the technologies just outlined by our opponents far from guarantees their automatic good. And as my partner Hillary has already pointed out, the assumptions of the pro side in tonight's debate are overly optimistic. We intend to compare the possibility of benefits with the certainty of harms. We will outline and develop the following 3 lines of argument. 1, that the complexity of an increasingly globalized world and the impossibility of a universal standard of bioethics will lead to the abuse of biotechnology. 2, that the psychological harms of this knowledge outweigh the benefits. And 3, that the abuses of genetic technology and information by those who wish to discriminate, design, and destroy will yield significantly more harm than good. We are asked tonight to consider a promise of more good than harm for humanity. Leon Kass, chair of the President's Council on Bioethics, reminds us of the fine line we walk between goods and harms with biotechnology. We want to identify evil as evil, but the challenge of biotechnology is that, as Kass says, the evils we face are intertwined with the goods we so keenly seek. We must also remember that we are dealing with the whole of humanity. forcing us to consider the past, the present, and the future in our debate. We cannot view this question from an American or even Western perspective, but rather a universal one. In order to critically examine the applications of genetic testing, we need a universal standard for deciding which applications are good and which are harmful. One may say that all human moralities are concerned with liberty, equality, prosperity, and security, but the order and the expression of these concerns varies globally. Both sides tonight desire a minimum global standard of bioethics, but differences between cultures make this impossible. Without a basic global consensus on bioethics, some nations will exploit biotechnology and genetic testing to further oppress marginalized groups within their societies. As we think about biotechnology in global terms, we inevitably confront the 90-10 gap, a situation where 90% of the current issues in bioethics affect only 10% of the world's population. Bioethical questions entertained by developed nations often lead us to overlook the more pressing health issues faced by developing countries. Though advocates of genetic technology theoretically agree on the need for equal availability of resources, this does not play out in reality. Our second argument this evening deals with the misinterpretation of data gleaned from genetic tests. Such information prompts actions with severe and lasting consequences. In other words, the implications of biotechnology are not kept within the lab. Rather, decisions based on newly available biotechnologies demand moral responsibility from prospective parents, relatives, physicians, and genetic counselors. Instead of promising more good than harm, the uncertain nature of this science encourages the misinterpretation of data. This leads to irreversible decisions with consequences which reach beyond the neutral realm of scientific data. For instance, in the US, when couples are informed of the possibility that their child may be born with Down syndrome, 84 to 91 choose to terminate their pregnancies. This has led to a decrease in the incidence of children born with Down syndrome, yet this can hardly be seen as a good when the so-called cure is simply the elimination of affected embryos. It is important to note that these decisions are made without the knowledge of how Down syndrome will be manifested in their future child. Finally, the potential for abuse of genetic technology through discrimination and enhancement outweighs the potential goods. As genetic tests become more prevalent, an increasing number of individuals are being discriminated by employers and insurers on the basis of their genetic makeup. While the pro side may argue that laws have been passed to protect individuals from genetic discrimination, it is clear that legislation lags years behind technological advance. We remind you that a law passed is not a law enforced. The biotechnology that detects the presence of certain genes also gives us the ability to manipulate them. The growth of the use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or the testing of embryos before they are implanted into the womb, is radically redefining the concept of what is good, as well as the role of a parent. If we are given the ability to create a good child, our ability may soon develop into a responsibility to design our child according to non-medical standards. And when we manipulate our genomes for the perfect outcome, we may begin to falsely believe that we are defined and bound by our genetic material. Biotechnologies and genetic testing do promise benefits, but these benefits or advantages are not synonymous with moral goods. At the same time, there are inevitable harms which accompany genetic testing. As my teammates Joanna and Joel will explain further, these harms are magnified by the psychological, emotional, and ethical implications of biotechnologies. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by saying that genetic testing and genetic research encompasses much more than simply prognoses. Genetic testing reveals a lot of information about the human genome and about the human being that enables people to develop drugs and therapies that can effectively cure diseases. One such disease that has been cured by genetic testing is ALD, which is a nervous system disorder in which a child is born and his nervous system slowly decays and he loses functionality until he finally dies. With genetic testing and genetic therapy, we have been able to reduce and stop the spreading of this disease within 15 days of genetic testing. This is a miraculous cure, if I have ever heard of one. And there have also been similar results for macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness in the elderly, and also with melanoma tumors. So there are results like this. As far as developing countries are concerned and the rest of the world, 90% of genetic diseases are located in the developing world. This testing has much broader implications than simply American middle-class society. As this testing is developed and encouraged, it will slowly spread to the rest of the world, just as most other medical advances do. The fear of psychological harm to certain people, we must not simply stop this testing, which promises so much good and so much healing, simply because some people are scared of it. The human genome is more like a weather map that determines possibilities for people. If we know about these possibilities for diseases early enough, they can become medicated and cured. If we know that somebody is at high risk for colon cancer, they can start to receive colonoscopies. And then once cancer starts to grow, they will have early warning to detect it and be cured for it. Thank you.
When it comes to genetics, and in fact, any ethical issue, we walk a tightrope. As agents of redemption, we must not neglect our responsibility to embrace the technology that offers hope. We must not let speculative fears keep us from providing tangible relief to suffering. Not only must we not do harm, we must go further. We must do good. As mentioned before, genetic technology is revolutionizing medicine. The powerful analysis of genetic testing has a promise to vastly reduce devastating disorders that affect many people. This understanding also increases the effectiveness and safety of drugs. 100,000 people each year die from an adverse reaction to drugs, and millions of others have uncomfortable or dangerous side effects. A one-size-fits-all approach to drugs has endangered patients because each person's body reacts differently to a given drug. Genetic testing can demonstrate exactly how these drugs will interact with genes, and so allow doctors to prescribe specific amounts. For example, internal bleeding in the brain can occur if a person is given just a little bit too much or too little of a drug called warfarin, currently used by 2 million Americans. Genetic testing has enabled doctors to get the exact dose correct and save many lives. Genetic technology also has the ability to cure diseases that were previously thought to be incurable. Through a procedure called gene therapy, diseases such as ALD, leukemia, and macular degeneration are now curable. In one test case, 9 out of 10 patients who were expected to die from leukemia had a complete recovery without any sign of regression. Genetic testing also has enabled doctors to operate on babies in the womb who would have otherwise died from a disease such as muscular dystrophy. Many of us are concerned that genetic testing will lead to abortion, and it is true that people use the information of genetic technology to excuse abortion, and this is wrong. However, this must not be blown out of proportion. 93% of abortions are due to social reasons, because the baby is either unwanted or inconvenient. Abortion is a much larger social concern that requires efforts on all fronts for us to combat. Genetics is also a broader field than simply the testing of embryos and babies in the womb. It can be used to identify risk factors in diseases in normally healthy people and allow them to avoid certain lifestyles that may increase their chances of getting a disease. This means that a person who has identified a risk of colon cancer in the late 20s can get a colonoscopy at 30 instead of 50, and so remove any cancer before it becomes malignant. As many of you know from personal experience, cancer is the #1 killer in the United States. This is a huge step forward in the battle against cancer. These kinds of benefits are things to be extremely excited about, Preventing a disease is far better than trying to cure it. What an amazing amount of pain and death can be relieved. Humankind is not meant to usurp God's position as creator. We must be co-creators under God's authority. 30% of children and 10% of adults in the American hospitals are admitted due to genetic disorders. Christians need to develop the science to help people adversely affected by genetic disorders, not disallow something that holds such promise. We must follow in the footsteps of men like Francis Collins and Eric Youngst, who early on in the research saw a need and set up a project to fund the research of ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. These grants, which fund hundreds of experts in social science, law, and theology, make up the largest amount of money ever to be given for research of a bioethical issue in the history of science. We are not being led into this blind. Francis Collins once said, and this is important for us to understand, he said, "To say that genetic engineering is unacceptable across the board because of its potential for creating ethical dilemmas is the most unethical position of all. It is basically to say, here is a powerful approach which could alleviate human suffering, but we are not going to use it because we are worried about the misuse that may occur. It is an unacceptable view from every standpoint, especially the theological one. This is not to say that there are not areas of genetics that need to be dealt with to avoid wrong decisions. The scientific and academic communities are well aware of many of these issues and are seeking ways to deal with them. However, the possible defects are far outnumbered by the health benefits of genetics." Thank you.
First of all, the con side resents the fact that our arguments are merely speculative fears. We are not fear-mongering, we are merely looking at history. The fact remains the last forced sterilization in the USA was not decades ago, it was 1981. It's not just the Nazis. Furthermore, they asked us to consider scientists as if they are greater beings than us. No, scientists are just as much liable to ethical concerns and problems. While Francis Collins is a great example of a Christian scientist, we remember that behind scientists is the bottom line to get results, to find the cure to your experiment, and ultimately to make a profit for the people who are funding you. They make an excellent point about abortion. Yes, they said that 93% are for social reasons. Let's not think for a second that a social reason isn't that a mother isn't capable of taking time to care for a Down syndrome baby. The reality remains is that a Down syndrome baby, while a joy, is harder to care for, and that is a social concern. We cannot go away from the fact that a resounding majority of abortions follow genetic testing. They also discussed individualized medicine. And while we affirm the ability to correctly diagnose an individual, we must also remember that we are dealing with humanity in this instance. We are called by Christ not to forget the least of them among us. And we must remember that individualized medicines mean that we can also individually kill better. Genocide, genocide, that's still a huge risk for us. One person with their hands on this technology can mean countless deaths and countless atrocities. We ask you to remember that we must do good, and that means we must show restraint, and that science must show humility in what it can and cannot do. It cannot control ethics. Thank you.
We are more than our genes. The pro side has advanced a reductionist position where the sum of humanity is that fateful double helix. But because of the inherent complexity of the human being, the knowledge gleaned from genetic testing can only feign certitude and simplicity. Let us examine the human genome. It is infinitely more complex than Mendel's pea pod. Given the disproportion of genetic traits to actual gene expression and the power embedded in lifestyle choices to influence that expression, test results yield only probable and statistical projections for future biological realities. Although only 1 in 667 Black children live with sickle cell anemia, 1 in 12 carry that genetic marker. Genetic sequences, themselves a fraction of the whole human being, defy certainty. Despite this limitation, science bombards patients with numbers and percentages that patients are ill-equipped to receive or interpret. A 15% increased chance of breast cancer spells a double mastectomy. A 20% increased likelihood of early onset Alzheimer's sounds like a death sentence. These predictions are made more devastating when we realize that our ability to diagnose forever outstrips our ability to cure. Such predictions, especially when they indicate diseases for which treatment is limited or non-existent, promise more harm than good. And what of lifestyle choices? Epigenetics, an emerging field in biology, examines how environmental factors, such as diet and behavior, serve as a second genome determining gene expression. Despite the claims of genetic determinists, individuals bear huge responsibility in determining how genes are expressed and employed. That responsibility, however, is increasingly eclipsed by the assumptions that our first genome has sealed our fate. Because of the biological complexity of the human genome and epigenome, genetic testing is not sufficiently predictive of gene expression to warrant the idealistic expectations of the pro team. This unpredictability is especially dangerous, given that genetic tests do not pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake. They demand decisions. Prenatal genetic tests coerce families into impossible dilemmas to either terminate their pregnancy or continue with the knowledge that their child may be born with a devastating disease. When one family member learns of a genetic propensity for disease, ought other family members undergo genetic testing? Should the defective member risk bearing children? These questions only begin to illustrate the added anxiety and unanswerable questions that the genetic tests advocated by the pro team prompt. The knowledge gained from genetic testing generates fear and multiplies reasons for unjust discrimination. Because potential for disease or disability is considered undesirable, suddenly the ethical notion of a wrongful death is inverted, and the gestation of a child possessing genes with potentially defective expressions is seen as wrongful life. In the United States in 2004, 84 to 91% of prenatal Down syndrome diagnoses resulted in abortion. A similar study in England showed that 94% of diagnoses resulted in abortion. Such decisions set a precedent for reducing lives to their genetic makeup. Another study indicates that more than half of Americans are either ambivalent to or supportive of government discrimination against parents who choose to bear children diagnosed with a potential for disease. As the con in tonight's debate, we suggest that such discrimination violates justice and guarantees harm. Heated by genetic testing technologies, not only is the pressure cooker of society redefining the roles of parents, it is also redefining the role of medicine. Beyond the preventative, diagnostic, and therapeutic powers of other medical technologies, genetic testing promises the poisoned apple of enhancement. As more pre-implantation selection techniques are made available, parents are opting to design their children in vitro. At Steinberg's Fertility Institute in 2004, 1 in 7 patients, motivated not by infertility or other medical limitations, chose pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for the sole purpose of selecting the sex of their child. We want to believe that a developed nation like ours is above eugenics, but several short decades ago in our developed nation, 60,000 Americans were lawfully sterilized in order to purify the genetic pool. Even people with good intentions are enticed by the ability to enhance, and, as my teammate Joby noted, genetic testing promises that others will abuse this technology. It takes only a few individuals with wrong intentions to do systematic and lasting damage to medicine, ethics, and our very concept of personhood.
First, I'd like to restate the fact that our team is against abortion. We believe that life begins at conception, and so whether it is an embryo in a fertility clinic or a baby in the womb, we are against the destruction of any life. Also, it's important to remember that genetic testing does not cause abortion. Genetic testing simply provides parents with information. It is the same thing, not the same thing, but it's similar to an ultrasound. A mother, after she has extensive ultrasounds, will have genetic testing through an amniocentesis or caloric villi sampling. These provide her with genetic information about her child. It is people who choose to use that information to use an abortion. This information can also provide many benefits, for example, fetal surgery, as well as fetal blood transfusions. This information can allow parents to know that, say, their child has spina bifida. This can allow them to have surgery in the womb. This can also allow for blood transfusions for people with sickle cell anemia. I think it's important that both teams remember that this is just simply information provided through our genes so we can make good decisions about the fetus. Secondly, on terms of stress and anxiety brought to us by genetic testing, that was one of my primary concerns coming into this debate. But now I've understood that in almost every case, genetic counseling follows genetic testing. Also, there's a great deal of stress and anxiety that can come with not knowing whether you have a genetic disease or disability coming for you. For many people, for example, consider someone with Huntington's whose parents has Huntington's disease. It's important that they have genetic testing in order for them to know whether they will have a disorder in their future. In closing, it is imperative that we not let our fears about the misuses of genetic testing keep us from pursuing the good of it. We should not be paralyzed by ethical considerations, but we should rather be mindful of these questions as we move forward. For, as Christians, we believe that they're not only sins of what we do, but sins of what we leave undone. It would certainly be a sin of omission to let our fears about genetic testing keep us from providing millions of people with treatment. Thank you.
Cases laid out, and now it's an opportunity for you, the audience, to pose questions. And we have two mics here that will be in the aisles. If you could just raise your hand and maybe just very briefly introduce yourself, say who you are, and say whether your question is for the pro or the con side.
Good evening. My name is Tim Averill. I have a question for the pro team. In the world that you envision, I'd like to know who is it that controls what biotechnologies get developed, and how do we determine which ones are going to be applied? So who controls it, and how do we know what ethical standard is going to be applied?
As it stands today, in the world that we live in, the research that is done in genetic testing and gene therapy is done primarily by research institutions and pharmaceutical companies. Who gets to decide what to do? Well, the researchers themselves in most cases. Researchers, however, are very, very much unanimously devoted to providing cures and helping alleviate suffering. And as it stands in today's world, this is probably a much more marketable situation as well. I don't think we need to fear, for instance, kind of dangerous world where people start going willy-nilly with enhancement, trying to make people superhumans or something like that, because the reality is that it's simply not feasible and not as lucrative as providing cures for diseases which are clearly understandable and can be easily developed into cures and therapies. So
Okay, another question. I think I see one at the top up here.
Good evening. My name is John Wendell. I have a question for the negative side. You speak of biotechnology and the applications promising harm rather than good. But isn't the science just science? Aren't we the ones who do the harm with the science? We take the ability to test and we do it, and that gives us information, and we take that information and we choose to have the abortion, say.
Yes, I'd say, first of all, that's correct. It is up to individual humans to decide what to do with this knowledge. But the fact is that I'd like to remind the audience that private companies equals private interest. And there's no one out there who is simply doing this for the good of humanity. I'd like to believe that, and there are many admirable people like Francis Collins for the benefit. The fact is that private interest and human selfishness always play in. We can never ensure that people are going to use this for good and not harm. And as history showed,
And just to reiterate, the resolution this evening asks us to consider not only the science, but also its applications. So what results from the science, as the negative case has laid out for you, is under consideration as well. So despite the claims of the pro side that science is science and that science is knowledge and therefore good, the resolution is asking us to consider science in the context of human action and its applications.
Okay, can everyone hear back there again? Maybe my ears are just going. Okay, the pro side wants to make just a brief response to that, and you guys have the same opportunity. If a question is not directed and you want to say something, just raise your hand. Yes or no?
It's okay. I just want to know if we were allowed to.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see. This gentleman right here said.
This is directed. My name is Carl. This is directed at the negative side. You mentioned how employers are using genetic testing and genetic profiling to discriminate against employees, or how they may. My question to you is, how is that not an extension of employers already use criminal background checks? They check, nowadays they're starting to check social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, even YouTube to find videos or other things about the prospective employee that may be undesirable. How is the genetic profiling, I'm not trying to justify it, but how is that not an extension of things like that? And by your position, are things such as checking the social networking sites, background checks, things like that, also not a good thing, in your opinion?
Okay.
Thank you for your question. We would like to point out that that with employers screening and possibly even discriminating based on those factors, those are controlled factors in which the individual makes choices and has made choices, which will result in the verdict being made as to whether they are hired or not. Genetics is they are uncontrolled. It is an uncontrolled factor, and really, what we're afraid of is discrimination being made not based on lack of merit, lack of ability, but rather on maybe a predisposition or a greater likelihood of developing some disease that would make the investment in them really just not worth it. And so, really, I guess that is our position.
What about another question directed for the pro? If you have a question for the pro.
Can we take that?
What? Okay, you want to respond to that real quick? Okay.
While the point is well made that these are control variables, that was just the question that was asked. Things like sex and background and social status, these are not control. These things are not determined by your choice. Most of the time people are born into these situations and can be discriminated because of this. So while the point is made, we'd just like to point that out, that not all cases are control.
Okay, for the pro side, I think right here.
This is a question for the pro side, and it is, given the historical example of humanity abusing technologies, for example, Alfred Nobel did not intend for dynamite to be used in war, but it has been and has caused horrific damage across the world. What makes biotechnology and the technologies associated with that different? And that's just one example. And so I'm just wondering what would distinguish this from other previous historical examples?
Thank you for your question. I certainly see your concern about, I think you mentioned dynamite. Sure, that's a terrible example of the misuse of technology. Another one would be the atomic bomb. You can definitely list off a lot of negative uses, but I also don't really think it's fair to compare something that promises medicinal healing to an instrument of mass destruction. That seems to be a little bit of an incongruity. But definitely, I think we see throughout history a lot of good and a lot of harm in technological advances. And I think it kind of comes down to us, it's our choice, it's our responsibility to choose well. And I think, I don't think that biotechnology is inherently bad or inherently good. It's going to be up to us to make sure that it's used for good and not for enhancement, but for medicinal purposes.
Might I just add that because of the way that genetic testing is developed, it would be a horribly inefficient weapon. Right now it's being developed to cure single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are very small mutations of the genome that cause serious defects in a human being when they're born. Trying to make that into a weapon would require much more effort, much more time than would be feasible or reasonable. I mean, it would be much wiser and much simpler simply to make another bomb.
Okay, a quick point by the con side on this.
A quick response to that. Two things. The first is that the requirement of the pro team would essentially be the universal standard of bioethics that my partner Joby has already informed you is an impossible standard. In order for us to decide which applications are good, which are harmful, to ensure that only medicinal healing results from biotechnology, a rigid standard of bioethics would have to accompany all of the technology that they're outlining. Such a standard doesn't exist and is virtually impossible to implement. So we urge you to consider the certainty of the harms that we have outlined and the contingency upon which their benefits are founded.
I would just also want to remind the audience, from a realistic point of view, rudimentary biotechnologies, yes, but biotechnologies nevertheless are used by governments such as China for one couple, one child policies, which is a heavily misogynistic practice because couples want a male in that culture, and also the reality that it takes only one person, again with maybe a non-human form of biotechnology, but it takes one dictator or one rogue leader of a country to use a scientist to develop biological weapons or something of that sort. So.
I have a question for the negative team. You seem to have a paradox that you're talking about, that humans are more than their genes, but they're also but you also seem to suggest that manipulation of genes is manipulation of humanity. Why is that? Why is it that equivalent? If we are more than our genes, then why is gene therapy any different from, say, me taking Adderall or a ADD student taking Adderall to increase intellectual capacity?
Point. I guess the real problem is that, and I know that the pro might disagree with this, but the fact is that a lot of pre-implantation genetic diagnostic institutes, the fact is they are talking about genetic engineering children. In fact, the leader that we mentioned earlier made a statement basically saying that we don't have the technology yet to determine hair color in a child, but wait 5 years and come back and we'll have it. And the fear is that we'll start to design our children in order to try to control them, and that will lead to the psychology of parenthood is going to fundamentally change. And that, I think, is where the real danger is, because, of course, the child who may be designed or genes are manipulated could choose to live his own life, but it's the parents and the psychology of producing a product rather than accepting a child unconditionally.
Quick response? Okay.
We would just like to respond to as far as PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The only way that is possible is through a really difficult process. In vitro is not something that most parents want to go through in order to create an embryo in a petri dish. Furthermore, there's only one clinic in the United States that allows parents to select for sex of their child, and they aren't yet able to select for hair color and eye color. Furthermore, being able to tell the sex of a child is relatively simple. It's really just looking at one chromosome. Trying to engineer things like intelligence, athletic ability, that's really just impossible. There's so many genes that control athletic ability, enhance intelligence, that there's really no feasible way of this kind of enhancement through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis.
May I quickly respond?
Very quickly.
Yes. 74% of IVF clinics are offering PGD in the U.S.
Okay, also, another question. Go out. Pick somebody, Ryan.
I wanted to I think that the con side mentioned that there was genetic testing somehow enhanced our ability to kill. I just wanted to know any evidence you have to back that up. I know that the South African government apartheid government from the time of its inception in 1948 until the time of its decline in 1994 tried to develop a program that would allow for a bacteria or some kind of virus that would kill specifically black people. And while that's horrible, they never even got close to succeeding. And I just want to know, like, I mean, I hope you didn't really research where that was, where that technology was coming from a sinister perspective, but I just want to know, like...
Okay, so what's your evidence, and is that to the con?
Yeah, what's the evidence of
the
genetic testing being able to actually be used to create diseases that will kill certain people?
Thank you for your question. Just to kind of reiterate something that our colleagues on the pro side said earlier, that is that they are right in saying that this biotechnology has not been fully developed as far as use in warfare. I mean, and that's probably obvious to everybody. That is not to say that it does not carry the potential for that. Where we see the technologies being utilized in killing, murder, or such, comes from our our observation of the abortion rates following genetic tests. I mean, you guys, we all know how to do a Google search. Immediately go back to your computers, look up the statistics from various sources. It's pretty alarming, and I mean, and it makes sense. You know, why would you pay to have prenatal surgeries when abortion costs less, and probably to somebody who doesn't have strong convictions regarding the I don't know, life beginning conception, probably makes more sense.
Okay, let's go to another question, and hands are going up. This gentleman on the very front row up here.
You talked about the impossibility of genetic engineering to make an athlete. It's just not feasible right now. Well, 100 years ago, it wasn't feasible to go into outer space, and we're doing it all the time now. 50 years ago, a computer took up the size of a room like this, and now you have more computing power in a laptop. So with the advances constantly being made in genetic research, how in your ideal world, I mean, because a lot of wonderful things are being done through genetic testing and genetic research, in your ideal world, how are you going to stop the potential for such enormous harm given man's track record in history of taking things that are neutral and can be very good, but also using them for extraordinary evil?
Okay, another question about technology and historical track record.
Well, we say that it is basically an impossibility to biologically engineer kids that are like really smart or really athletic, because there are so many genes that affect being athletic and being intelligent. Francis Collins, who is one of the most famous scientists today, say that it's just kind of funny, you need zillions of embryos to actually pick one that is really athletic or intelligent, like when you're trying to like engineer kids. And that's just like, that's an impossibility.
If I could just add to that, it seems like we're already seeing, you know, certain advancement in drugs like Adderall. For instance, things like plastic surgery. We're already seeing human kind of desire for that. And I think maybe something else that is called for is sort of just a shift in the ethical paradigm, where we can't blame, you know, even if enhancement is possible in 200 years or something like that, if they suddenly, anyway, if it's possible in 200 years, it's our ethics that need to change and not blame the technology itself. I think that's kind of where we're at with it.
Okay.
Hi, this is for the negative case. It seems that the majority of your case comes from a moral standing, the betterment of the morality of humankind. I'm wondering if there is a specific negative case for the resolution without specifically moral goodness and betterment of humanity, seeing that the resolution is actually seen as a promotion of the human species as betterment for the species rather than the moral implications.
Okay.
Sorry.
The point is a specific question. Yeah.
Sorry?
You want to rephrase the question?
All right, okay. Seeing the resolution I can kind of see it going at it a couple different ways. First way of says applications promise more good than harm for humanity. The good meaning morally good, or the good meaning promotion of the species in health or population, or however that can be taken.
What do you guys mean by good, your understanding of that?
Yeah, we would advocate for a holistic understanding of the term good, not just a very utilitarian what's best for the human species. Because we can employ all sorts of horrific means, and many of the good, even the good-intentioned efforts of past generations have been accomplished through terrible means, but it was for the good of the species. So we would advocate a broad conception of the word good, not just the thriving of the species, but the holistic perspective.
However,
go ahead, quick weighing in on the good.
Just from what we're hearing from you, I don't feel like we're hearing that type of good, the medicinal and physical good of man. I feel like that's not really something the team is advocating. For example, their remarks about better health. What we are saying is better health. This can provide cures of things such as, cystic fibrosis, just like tons of different disorders and diseases we suffer from today.
Okay, I'm trying to distribute questions. How about, I don't think I've got anyone from this group up here in the right. Here's a woman right here.
Hi, my name is Annette, and this question is for the negative case. I heard, maybe I'm hearing you incorrectly, but I heard someone talking about the possibility of oppression between the developed world towards the developing world. And I just want a little bit of clarification, since we do know of other technologies that the developed world has access to that the developing world doesn't necessarily have access to. And we do know of universal bodies that do help administer kind of the moral, the morality or the ethical conduct of just other things like climate change or whatever, like we have, the WTO or whatever. So I'm just kind of trying to get clarification because I'm not exactly understanding how the developed world would oppress potentially the developing world in the case of that genetic testing was advanced.
Well, one of our main concerns is that it's a fundamental injustice to invest as much as we do in promoting possibility of sex selection in embryos and designing, eventually designing your children, and just other higher level issues of bioethics when there are still people suffering, dying from lack of clean water, suffering, starving to death, and we can't. There's no point in implementing the biotechnologies that we're talking about in a country where people can't even, put food on the table from day to day. Until we resolve those issues, it's immoral to really talk about the level we are.
In a single word, I think the problem is ignorance. We're investing countless dollars to invest these things. And we are very technologically advanced, yet we seem to have ignored, or at least we haven't bothered to pursue as actively as we should, the fact that malaria still is a scourge in the developing world, that they don't have access to clean water. While we're talking about curing not even necessarily fatal diseases, but simply harmful diseases. And we're all for curing diseases, but that ignorance is something that disturbs us and concerns us.
Yeah, if we could also just point out that that in the developing world, we're seeing a greater prevalence of these genetic disorders because of things like closer blood ties. And so 90% of these are actually in developing world countries. And so we need to develop this technology further in order to bring it to them. Sure, we're going to see it in the West at first, more prevalently, as with all medical advances. But as the technology is developed, we're going to see equal access. And 90% of congenital malformations and genetic disorders are in the developing world.
Okay. Quick
if I could respond.
Add that if we were to cease genetic research, money would not all of a sudden go to some other sort of relief effort. But in fact, the money that we're spending on genetic research will not only provide benefit for the third world in the short term, like sending over clean water or extra food would, but in the next 10, 20, 30, 100 years from now, the genetic basis that we have established now will be around and will be developed to help provide cures for everybody worldwide, just like much of modern medicine becomes more available.
Okay, why don't we do two more questions? The last two were directed at the pro side. I'm sorry, at the con side. So who has one directed for the pro team? You pick over there, Ron.
Hey, I'm Zion here. I have a questions for the pro side. I heard about that scientists have found a gene in particular that can possibly, if they innovate enough, they can possibly, it's the P55 gene. I'm pretty sure some of you guys are familiar with it. But they said that if you can find a way to either turn it off or turn it on, it can regulate. They found out that it regulates cellular growth. It tells cells whether to stop reproducing or start reproducing. And the implication of that is the cure for tumors and cancer. Now, if that is feasible, if they can actually use this to cure cancer, they'll have the knowledge of how your tumors or your cells work and how to turn them off and on. And if they do make this, what is the possibility of them implementing this sort of knowledge and technology inside of a virus so that they can just have, if anybody comes into power, have this agenda for bioweaponry, like they mentioned? What is the possibility of them actually taking this technology and perhaps, like, you guys seen zombie movies, right? Like you have mass murdering of this virus just spreading across the land, killing off people because this virus affects the P55 genes that regulate cell growth.
Okay, so potential for unintended consequences.
Well, that may seem like a feasible solution or feasible outcome of genetic testing. However, given the reality of genetic testing and the reality of the way that genetic therapy and viruses and the science works, it would be nearly impossible to create such a zombie virus. The way that genetic therapy and gene replacement works nowadays, it's considered a huge success when they can get about 15% of the cells to take up the new genes that they're trying to insert, which is enough to provide the new proteins needed to medicate certain diseases. But these engineered viruses, they're called viral vectors because they're used to deliver the cures and the healthy genes, are not nearly hardy enough to spread around and cause mass chaos or mass destruction of life. They would most likely die out very soon, just because the instability of the clinical viruses that they're using. If you're going to look for the mass extermination of life, you would not be looking into genetic testing. That would be a waste of your time. You would be looking into other fields, which would accomplish it much more efficiently.
Okay, let's go to a final question. And
so my question is for the affirmative case, and essentially, in a negative case, please correct me if I've gleaned this information a little bit wrongly, but essentially the promise for harm that you have presented is a little bit clearer to me than your promise for good, and essentially it's come across as precedent, humankind's general propensity to manipulate things into terrible weapons and the abortion rates. But my question for the pro team is, what have you provided as the promise for good as a result of continued genetic testing and application?
As we've said, a lot of these 90% of genetic disorders are in the developing world. 7.6 million children are born every year with genetic disorders, and right now, without genetic testing, those disorders have no cure. Furthermore, in the developing world, often they don't have even the very rudimentary cures that we have without genetic testing. There have been cures that are being accomplished right now, and we're hoping for more. Right now, macular degeneration has been cured through this kind of viral vectors that Zach was just talking about, being able to actually, once we know which genes are causing this disorder, we can then, put those healthy genes into a virus, and they can infect just parts of your gene, which is enough, parts of your cells, which is enough to provide you with those healthy proteins that you don't
have. If I could
okay,
just
why don't I, each team can have one in the discussion area, a final comment if you want it, before we go to the formal conclusion. So go ahead.
Yeah, I would just respond to that statement specifically with two caveats, and that is if it ever becomes cost-effective for these people who live on $1 a day or less, and if it becomes cheaper than abortion, which is precedent and current practice, is the current accepted way to deal with the existence of genetic disorders. So.
Okay, do you guys have any final thing you want to say from the discussion?
Well, I think your question sort of comes down to the con side is saying that the probabilities of human nature is that we're not going to use this technology right, and we're not going to apply it right. And there may be some valid arguments for that, but we would point to things like, I think we mentioned before, there's been a research into the ethical, legal, and social implications. And as we said, this has been funded, this is not just scientists, this is theologians, lawyers, people in the social sciences, philosophers. So we point to this as a way in which the technology is actually not overleaping the ethics that are being developed. And this is one of the first times that ethics has actually been, as Francis Collins started off the Human Genome Project, they recognized the need to develop the ethics and to make sure that there was research in the ethics because of the nature of genetic technology. And this would be one of our main points is, can't be too pessimistic, we could, but we've got to have some hope, and I think there are some really tangible benefits in terms of medicine, development of ethics and research, which are really pointing in the right direction.
Okay, now we'll go to the formal concluding statements. We'll begin with the pro side and then end with the con side.
Thank you for your attention and excellent questions this evening, everyone. I have just a few concluding remarks before we leave. I stand before you now to ask you to examine what is in your own hearts and minds in light of everything you've heard tonight. Friends, the truth is that biotechnology is in the process of revolutionizing medicine as we know it. We are on the cusp of a new era, and we cannot change that. Our challenge is not to swim backwards, but to navigate these new currents with wisdom. Human beings have reflected God's creativity in their tool-making abilities since the discovery of fire. From the agrarian revolution to the invention of the printing press and the harnessing of steam for power, history is full of examples where the face of the world was altered because of human innovation. Excessive fear and blind optimism have always accompanied these profound changes, and the current situation is no different. We do not believe in making unrealistic promises about the capacity of science to change the world, nor in allowing disproportionate fears to inhibit our ability to use technology wisely. We must instead see the dangers and promises for good simultaneously, which will keep our pride in check while still allowing for the hope we so fundamentally need. We maintain that despite both the pros and cons you have heard this evening, genetic testing holds enormous promise for good. Human beings will determine how it is used, and we have a responsibility to choose well. We know from the parable of the talents that to whom much is given, much will be required. The servant who buried the money entrusted to him displeased his master, while the servants who used their master's money faithfully were rewarded. It is important for us to remember that we too must not hide the gifts God has given us. We should not sit idly and watch people suffer because we are fearful. Rather, we must do all we can to provide healing as long as there are broken people in this world. It follows then that we must make mercy and the alleviation of suffering our continuous goals. We must press on in the field of genetics in the name of global compassion and human dignity for all of the lives we can save, as Christ wants us to do as imitators of him, the great physician. The World Health Organization states that genetic disorders affect millions of people worldwide, and that the prevalence of genetic disorders is much greater in other parts of the world. Higher birth rates, closer blood ties, and reproduction into later ages cause a larger number of children with genetic disorders to be born. Of the 7.6 million children born annually with severe genetic or congenital malformations, 90% of these infants are born in mid- and low-income countries. Thus, genetic disorders seen in the West are far more common in other countries. I cannot think of a better reason to support and further improve genetic testing and its applications than global mercy. Genetic testing can and should be used in developing countries. As with all medical advances, a good example of which being penicillin, we will see equal access to genetic technology only when it is further developed and becomes more widespread. We need to encourage the progress of genetic testing in order for this to occur. Furthermore, we mourn deeply for each and every child who is aborted, but we celebrate that advancement in the field of genetic testing will actually decrease this number as more and more mothers are able to have their children's disorders corrected in the womb. For instance, unborn children with spina bifida can now be diagnosed, undergo spinal repair, and have healthy lives because of prenatal genetic screening. Unborn babies with sickle cell anemia can now receive in utero cell transplantation, dramatically increasing their ability to tolerate blood transfusions once they are born. We are also filled with hope when we learn that 8 out of 10 children with severe combined immunodeficiency or bubble boy syndrome will now live normal lives outside of their homes because of gene replacement. We rejoice when a person is able to prevent diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and many types of cancer because they received good information and changed their lifestyles accordingly. We cannot deny the good that comes from a second chance at life. Everyone here will admit that this world is in many ways terribly flawed, but it is also abundantly good. As with everything, we recognize that biotechnology has two sides, and we must be careful to uphold the sanctity of life as we move forward. But there is no going back. We cannot pretend we have not tasted knowledge. We cannot live in ignorance or try to eradicate the field of genetics now that we have the ability to save lives. A child who does not walk is safer than one who does, but we would never tell that child not to get up and try. Just as they must walk, humanity must persevere in its newest challenge. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. This is what we must hold to. Everyone in this room can and should do their part to be faithful stewards of God's gift of genetic testing in the name of healing. Thank you.
It is clear that benefits exist from biotechnology. Genetically catered medicine and the possible eradication of disorders like Huntington's or Alzheimer's disease are promising benefits that one day may enable us to live healthier lives. We are not against such developments. Indeed, as Christians, we welcome the ways in which biotechnology can help us realize the kingdom of God through physical healing. Nevertheless, our objections to the resolution remain. The problems we have raised betray the lack of foresight of the proposition. With law and ethics often 20 to 30 years behind scientific progress, such advances lead to discrimination and political oppression. Though often misused, the analogy of the slippery slope is quite appropriate in this case, given the radical redefinition of personhood which biotechnology brings. With clear examples of abuses already referenced, it is imperative to remember that, as priest and author Richard Newhouse has said, good intentions are not moral arguments. As we've observed, biotechnological research is often guilty of heavily favoring developed world concerns. With easily preventable conditions devastating much of the developing world, applications of biotechnology are in many cases only increasing the divide between the haves and the have-nots. The funding-driven nature of the biotechnology industry further exacerbates this dilemma as research addresses the concerns of its financiers. Historical precedence for these inequalities bodes poorly for an affirmation of the resolution. Francis Collins has rightly observed that it is not knowledge itself, but the way in which knowledge is put to use that acquires an ethical dimension. Thus, as we consider the applications of biotechnology, we must be aware that in the absence of a universal moral foundation, they become a threat rather than a blessing to humanity, being used as a weapon of tyrants or an exploitative tool for social control. Tragically, abortion is the primary means currently used to avoid the development of genetic disorders, as it is simple and, for most, cost-effective. With current technology, 90% of children with spina bifida are still nevertheless aborted. Those deemed genetically unfit by parents and doctors are being eliminated at an appallingly high rate. As the ability to diagnose continues to outstrip the ability to cure, pressure to employ this means will only increase. This is hardly a promise of good. In the Nathaniel Hawthorne story, The Birthmark, the scientist Aylmer creates a potion for his eager wife Georgiana that would remove a minor birthmark, the one flaw in her beauty, from her cheek. Sadly, the potion, which effectively removed the birthmark, ended up killing her. Aylmer's confidence in his own abilities blinded him to the full implications of his actions. The analogy of this story to the present situation is clear. Without a realistic grasp of the capabilities and limits of biotechnology, we will do irreparable harm to ourselves and others. While the hope is high that we'll be able to alleviate some human suffering with further developments, we risk destroying our basic concept of personhood. Biotechnology can be a helpful tool, but unguided by a respect for the image of God in humans, it denigrates the human person and replaces the Christian vision of the kingdom of God with a soulless biotechnological one. In Greek, the words bios and zoe both mean life. As people become fixated upon purifying and perfecting the human genome, the bios, or physical existence, replaces acknowledgement of the zoe, or deeper essence of life. Biotechnology cannot solve the fundamental problem of evil, but as people increasingly view this science as the panacea for all our woes, we lose a sense of the need for wisdom, virtue, and moral exertion. Flatly equating genetic health and possible genetic developments with goodness is naive and fails to establish a complete understanding of the human person. The negative case this evening is not in favor of smashing test tubes or returning to a time before penicillin. We insist, however, that we must adopt a critically realistic perspective, not allowing our hopes to cloud our better judgment. Biotechnology offers many benefits for living a healthy life, yet it cannot provide for our deeper needs: a moral vision, a sense of human dignity, in some what philosophers have often deemed eudaimonia, the good life. As historian and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr observed, we are more desperately in need of genuine charity than of more technocratic skills. While seeking to alleviate suffering, let us maintain a practical sense of the limits of biotechnology and constantly stand guard against the dangers which it poses for global human good and the importance of each individual as a creature made in the very image of God. Thank you very much.
Seems sort of cruel now to make you vote on these two sides, but we're going to send them out to the secret VIP lounge. They're here. Okay, it was a very close vote, but the final tally was for the pro side received 125 votes, and the con side received 103 votes. So the pro side. Again, I hope, if anything, it's raised a lot of questions for you guys to think about. Part of their assignment, due in a week now, I think, right, is they turn in a report and a bibliography. So they're really immersed in the research and some of the literature on these issues. I'm sure if you contacted them, they'd be glad to share that information with you. But again, it was a wonderful debate, and let's give them all a hand. And thank you so much for coming in.